We will now go to item 8. I'll just turn my pages here. I need to just cover off, there's no local board input. There are no extraordinary items that have been raised with me prior. So that takes us to item 8, which is a discussion of our submission to the Transport and Infrastructure Committee of Inquiry into the congestion pricing in Auckland. And welcome David Hawkey, Head of Growth Transport Infrastructure Strategy, Robert Simpson from the same unit. He's the Manager of Transport Strategy. And please come up. So this is to receive an update on the Select Committee inquiry into congestion pricing and delegate a group of the Planning Committee members. You can see the motions there, and provide direction for that group to approve the council submission. But I can say that the submission will be circulated amongst all the members of this committee prior to it being finally approved. Now the motions will put up there as well. I will move. Mayor, would you second? Thank you. And there is one addition. Have we got to scroll up on the addition? And there's that under B6 members, the need for ongoing dialogue with Aucklanders. So I will hand to, I think, is it in your good hands, Robert, to introduce, or is it David?
I'm going to say something. Thank you, Chair. Look, Robert will give a quick presentation and then we'll take some questions. I also have Brian Mickey, who's a Special Advisor from Auckland Transport. So we're doing a joint submission on this matter with Auckland Transport.
Welcome, Brian.
Right, well, good morning, everyone. So today we'll talk you through the process that we're going through to develop a submission on the Select Committee inquiry into congestion pricing. Builds off the back, of course, of the Congestion Question project, which you've considered on a number of occasions in the past. So there's the outline of the presentation today. I will try to make it relatively quick on the assumption that you've had a chance to read the report, which sets out a lot of this information in more detail. So before we get into the specifics of the submission and work that's been done in Auckland, just a quick recap of what congestion pricing is and the case for it. So it's premised on the notion that vehicles travelling at times of peak demand and on congested routes place a greater burden on the network and create greater costs for other users than vehicles travelling at other times and on other routes. So the premise being that if we price that into the amount that those users charge, it will incentivise behaviour change. So basically, by placing a charge on access to selected routes for vehicles at times of greatest congestion, the idea is to encourage people to think about how they travel. Okay, primarily through shifting to other modes, whether it be PT active modes. Travelling at alternative times, travelling at less congested times, making shorter trips perhaps, local trips rather than more distance trips, or avoiding trips altogether. The thinking being that with sufficient behaviour change, less congestion will result. But the key to sustaining that improvement over the longer term is mode shift, as it is with many of our other transport priorities. Keep on pressing the wrong button. Okay. So the Select Committee inquiry builds on work already undertaken over the last 3 or 4 years through the Congestion Question project, TCQ. So this work emerged from ATAP in 2016, which a key finding of which was that investment in infrastructure and services alone would not be sufficient to make much of a dent in congestion, and therefore some kind of demand management tool was required. So the overall purpose of the congestion question work is to undertake to provide the data and the necessary information needed to support an ultimate decision on whether or not to introduce congestion pricing in Auckland. So that work has been a partnership between Auckland Council, Auckland Transport and central government agencies. And that partnership has been both in terms of officials working together and also our decision making as well. We last came to the committee just a few months ago in December last year to present to you the phase 2 work from the Congestion Question project. And I'll take you through some of the key findings again now. The main one being that there is a strong case for implementing congestion charging in Auckland. The work found that there's likely to be significant potential improvements in network performance, somewhere in the order of 8 to 12%, which means traffic levels which we would typically expect to see at school holiday times. And obviously that has implications for travel times and journey reliability. The work considered had a long list of quite a long list of different approaches. It considered 5 approaches to congestion pricing in detail, out of which emerged 2 to be advanced for further investigation or refinement: the city centre cordon and strategic corridors, which would be the latter being the implementation of a charge on selected corridors around the region. Some of the other findings from the phase 2 work: congestion pricing would support environmental improvements through reduced vehicle kilometres travelled, freer flowing traffic. Some work was undertaken, 2 pieces of work was undertaken on the impact on Māori. It found that in a financial sense, the impact on Māori households was very similar to those on households across the board. That was based on 2013 census data. It did, however, another piece of work, however, did find that there's possible negative impacts on mana whenua identity in terms of the implementation of what is effectively an additional barrier to access to places of cultural significance. So there was 2, as I say, pieces of research done on that, both of which are publicly available on the TCQ website. It found that congestion pricing would place additional financial pressure on low-income households if congestion charges are unavoidable, i.e. by that what we mean is if there's a lack of alternative. So if people have no alternative but to travel at peak times when the charge is enforced, then obviously that will create an additional financial burden for them. So therefore, improved alternatives are essential, and that's something that we heard loud and clear from you last time we were here in December last year. So on that, work on congestion pricing we've brought it to the committee on 4 occasions over the last few years, starting back in 2016, where the governing body agreed to a progressive movement towards road pricing. Then in 2017, we came to you again with another update. 2018, you received the phase 1 work and approved the movement towards the phase 2, the findings of which I've just summarised for you. And lastly, just a few months ago, December last year, you approved work to go to phase 3. There were a number of key messages that came out of that meeting, and we heard you loud and clear on that, and they have very much shaped the submission that we're proposing to send to the Select Committee, and we'll take you through those messages in a minute. But first, just some information on the Select Committee inquiry itself. So it closes on the 20th of May, which is 2 weeks from now, and it has asked for responses to a number of key issues that were identified throughout the TCQ work. The thing about this, of course, is that at the time we came to you in December last year, we weren't anticipating a Select Committee inquiry. We were going to the proposal was that phase 3 of the TCQ work would investigate these key issues at a more leisurely pace, if you like, over a longer time period, and then report back to yourselves in due course. However, the Select Committee inquiry has created a little bit of uncertainty as to how that work will happen. The work still will happen. At this stage, we're just not entirely sure whether it will happen within the Select Committee process itself or under the auspices of something similar to the Phase 3 work as previously envisaged once the Select Committee has finished its work. That's not yet clear, but we are very clear that that detailed work will happen, and it needs to happen in order to support your final decision on whether or not to proceed with congestion pricing. The thing about the submission timeframes, of course, is it doesn't allow that work to happen prior to May the 20th. And so the submission that we will distribute to you in the very near future, rather than taking a strong stance on any particular issue, it really sets out what some of the key concerns for council have been that we've heard from you, and what some of the key questions that the Select Committee and the work further down the line will need to consider before we can come back to you with a proposal for a final decision. And as with the work to date, Auckland Council and Auckland Transport expect to be fully involved in this, both at an officer level and through yourselves as decision makers. So moving on to the scope of the submission, as I said, it's very much shaped around the key issues that we heard from you in December last year, which were very well aligned, as it happens, with the work of TCQ Phase 2 as well. So the key recommendation that we're bringing you today is that Auckland Council offers its in principle support for, thank you, for congestion charging, but very much dependent on a number of very key issues being addressed, which I'll take you through in a slightly more detail in a minute, which is set out in the committee agenda item, that being the mitigation of equity impacts, making sure that we have quality alternatives to paying the charge in place in advance, and that the emphasis continues to be, as it has been to date, on behaviour change rather than the generation of additional revenue. So we're not asking for your support through the submission for a particular scheme. That's not what we're asking at all. It's higher level in principle support, which effectively enables us to carry on and do the further work down the track so we can come back to you so you can make a fully informed decision in due course. One really positive aspect of this is that both Auckland Transport and ourselves are very closely aligned, both at an official level. So we're jointly preparing the council submission, and it will be taken to a delegated group of AT board members for their endorsement prior to it going to the delegated group of planning committee members for final approval. So one of the key issues that came out of the December Planning Committee meeting was this, the notion that before we can put in place congestion charging in any particular area, in any particular corridor, there really must be quality alternatives in place. So that was an underlying principle of the congestion question work as well, because of course, without those quality alternatives, you're not really giving people the option of changing the way in which they travel, certainly not in a mode shift sense anyway. So in effect, we would be imposing an additional financial burden without giving them that behaviour change option. And that's not in keeping with the intent of congestion question work to date, which has been all about promoting behaviour change, as I say, rather than revenue generation. So therefore, more work is required. As I say, that was to happen under Phase 3, but will still now happen, but exactly how is still a little bit up in the air. More work is required on how we select corridors for inclusion in the scheme. And critical to that will be understanding the travel needs of affected communities, the existing provision of other modes along those corridors, and obviously planned and funded through the RLTP improvements for PT and active modes along those corridors. So those are three key things that will be front and centre for any consideration of corridors to be included within the scheme, and that we'll come back to you with. Of course, what constitutes quality alternatives is also a key consideration. What do we mean by that? And that work still needs to be undertaken as well. So the submission will make Auckland Council's position fairly clear on this, very clear on this. As I say, taking what we heard at December and subject to what we hear today, that the availability of PT and active modes is a critical factor in determining where the scheme is to be applied. Very closely related and equally important issue is the mitigation of the congestion pricing on equity issues. How can we offset the impact on particularly on vulnerable communities, lower income households? So this was a critical issue, as I say, identified from listening to you last time round, but also as a critical issue that underlay the congestion question work itself, and it will drive further work. So, as I stated before, on an absolute dollar term basis, given the increased propensity of higher income households to drive, in all likelihood they will pay more in absolute dollar terms, but in terms of proportion of income, the impact will be more greatly felt for lower income households. So therefore, some form of relief will be necessary in order to ensure equitable access to opportunities is maintained. So some of the key questions that will need to be resolved as we undertake the further work is just better understanding how the impacts of any scheme vary between different groups. Questions such as, what users therefore should be eligible for relief, and what is the best mechanism to deliver that relief, and what level should it be set at? But inherent in this, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off here between addressing equity issues and some of the other objectives that you might associate with congestion pricing, being the environmental objectives, of course, obviously front and centre congestion relief itself, and the amount of funding available for investment in the transport network. So the TCQ work to date has made its position fairly clear on this, and its preferred scheme opted to set the charges as low as possible in order to promote behaviour change. So it came very much down on the side of equity as opposed to some of the other potential objectives around environment and the amount of funding available in particular. So the TCQ Phase 2 work looked at or identified a number of measures for further evaluation, one being a cap on daily charges, and it looked at in particular, specifically rather, a $7 cap. It looked at exemptions for low emissions vehicles, obviously the thinking there being to encourage their uptake and the consequential impact on emissions that may have. Increased funding for the total mobility scheme, so relief for those who are reliant on taxis and specialised vehicles to get around. Relief linked to community services cards, discounts for the community services card holders. There's probably also potential to look at a more discretionary type consideration for those who may not fall within whatever relief mechanism is ultimately put forward, much like the rates relief scheme. There might be provision for some kind of scheme for those who are experiencing undue hardship, may not necessarily fit the criteria for those who get relief, but nevertheless some kind of consideration is needed. One important thing to note here, of course, is, and you'll recall this from the ATAP discussions, is that ATAP included funding for the Community Connect card. And you'll recall that's a card that offers heavy discounts on public transport services for community service card holders. And that will be in place well before any congestion pricing scheme is implemented. Whilst the primary objective in the terms of reference for the congestion question work was on addressing congestion itself, there are of course co-benefits as well around the environmental impacts. And that primarily arises from reduced vehicle kilometres travelled, reduced use of private vehicles, arising from the behaviour change and mode shift. But if the amount or the level of these environmental benefits very much dependent on the details of the scheme, in particular the level of charge, how widely the scheme is implemented, and the level at which mitigations is set. So as I said before, TCQ set out to keep the charges as low as possible for equity reasons, but the corollary of that, of course, is that the impact on emissions would be relatively modest if we were to keep the charges low. Flip side, if to achieve greater environmental benefits, both in terms of emissions reductions and other pollutants, then you could up the charge and further disincentivise driving with consequential equity impacts. Lastly, revenue implications. So as I've said, the aim of the congestion charging is very much around behaviour change, not around revenue generation, but obviously it does generate revenue, and that's clearly very important. The level of which that revenue will be is dependent on the details of the scheme, and so when we come back to you in due course, we'll have much more information about that. So the TCQ project, and also our recommendations today, set out that this revenue should be used to pay for the operation of the scheme, to provide for the necessary public transport and active mode improvements that I've just talked about, to fund any necessary mitigations, and offset regional fuel tax. So another trade-off here, and it's reasonably obvious, the trade-off between mitigations, the trade-off is between mitigations on one hand and the level at which the congestion charge is set, versus on the other hand the amount of funding that's available for investment in the transport network. So there are a number of hard decisions ahead around these key trade-offs. So there are recommendations. In principle, support, subject to the things that I've just run through, noting that the submission itself will make key points in relation to a number of these issues, and then delegating to the chair, the deputy chair, the mayor, and a member of the IMSB to direct us as we finalise the submission and ultimately approve it, and then at a yet to be determined date to front to the Select Committee and present Auckland Council's views. Just a couple of notes on process from here. As Councillor Darby noted, we will be circulating a draft submission to all elected members and IMSB members in the very near future. Dates still to be determined. And we'll be welcoming feedback, and we'll be taking that feedback to the delegated group of Planning Committee members. That's it for my presentation. I'm relatively new in this work, whereas David and Brian have been involved since year dot, and so I suspect that most of your questions will be deflected from me to them. So thank you.
Well, I think that was an invitation, wasn't it? Yes. Anything further to add, Brian, from the AT perspective? I know the intention is a joint submission, Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, but welcome your additional words.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, the AT resolutions strongly endorse the findings of the TCQ, reports and their recommendations, and we're looking forward to engaging, obviously, in line with Auckland Council, with the Select Committee as we go forward.
Thank you, Brian. David, anything further?
No, Chair. I think that's a good summary. I suppose my reflections here is, we have discussed this matter a number of times at this committee, and some of the key things to take out here is, even going back to 2016, we've recognised that congestion is a very hard nut to crack through investment alone. And we've often thought that we need to manage demand better if we're going to address that and get better performance. Since that time, we've also started to think things like climate change emissions, and again, things like travel demand management are very important for that sort of thing. So I suppose in terms of the Select Committee process, which is new, this is an opportunity, I think, and this is what we're recommending, for the committee to say that we want to continue looking at this work. We're not endorsing a scheme here, but there is need for such a scheme in Auckland Council's toolkit, and we want to continue discussing this with government. I suppose we have to remember, until there's legislation change, there is no ability for us to do any sort of scheme at the moment, sort of thing. So I would hope we'd try to keep the door open for this discussion with government.
Thank you, David. Now, look, we'll take questions now. Just at the outset, if I can pose this question. So, members, we'll take questions and then we'll go for comments later on, okay? So, initially it's questions. So, Robert or David, Brian, we've been canvassing this for almost 5 years. There's been a number of reports. It's been a joint exercise, but we have been leading it. We've been the principal lead, along with Waka Kotahi and the Ministry of Transport. I think it's the three, plus Treasury. Treasury were a partner in the congestion question, stage 1, 2, and would have been part of stage 3. So can you just give us an account, some explanation about offering the very cautious in-principle support versus support versus not support? And can you also canvass, have we, over the years, being the lead, been effectively in principle, in support in principle, by taking that lead? And I'm reflecting on your last comments there as well, David. Can you just take us through
thank
that?
you, Chair. I suppose if, in terms of have we come out and said that we wish to apply congestion charging in Auckland? No, we have not. But since 2016, there's been a number of resolutions that have pointed towards the need to have such a tool. And I think the first one was the work that we did in the 2016 ATAP, which was quite a comprehensive amount of work. And there was a resolution at that time as part of ATAP that we needed to explore congestion pricing and demand management more widely, because even with significant investment, we had seen that the congestion and network performance was not improving with that investment. And we've seen in subsequent ATAPs that we are still struggling with this question, because it goes, I suppose what we are dealing with here is the fundamental challenge that as we put more capacity on roads, and for PT as well, it generates the ability to people to get back into their cars and to use the network. And for most of the day, that's not such a problem. But at peak parts of the day, this is a significant problem. And there's been quite a lot of studies done about what congestion does to people and their lives, and it is quite significant. There is access problems in terms of you can't get to things that you want. There's stress and other well-being related, and there's also less time to do things that are important to you. For example, it comes up quite a lot in these social impact studies, is less time with family. So that finding was, I suppose, sent us on this track. And then we agreed to work jointly with government on a process to try to understand, firstly, was congestion a problem for Auckland? And the first phase of that work came out saying, yes, it was a problem for Auckland, and we needed to do something about it. And basically, this committee agreed with that finding. And then there was a second phase of work where we were asked to look at a range of options to address that. And also, we also were asked to look at, given these options, to try to have the best look we can on what it meant for a range of factors, including social, environmental, and to look at what it meant for Māori. And we did good work on that. I mean, some of these are difficult things to get to the bottom of, and that's why there's more work, but we reported back on that. And I suppose the conclusion of that was in December 2020, where this committee accepted the findings, then asked us to go ahead and do phase 3 of the work, which was really do the more detailed design, but also engage in a process of discussion with the people of Auckland about congestion pricing, and then also fundamentally look at Māori and equity issues in more detail. That work started, but then government decided to have the select committee process, which I suppose in a way has made it slightly unclear to us how we are going forward with this work. So in effect, the phase 3 has been put on hold until we get more clarity around this. So the first phase of this, in some ways I look at this sort of positively in terms of what we asked for, because it is a form of asking Aucklanders, because this select committee is asking all Aucklanders who are interested to submit on congestion pricing or charging. So in effect, it is responding a bit to having a dialogue with Auckland. But what it means in terms of how we work with the selection committee needs to be resolved. So I suppose some of these resolutions we're putting forward today is to saying, given that history, we are concerned about congestion. We want to have the right tools, I suppose, to deal with that sort of thing. But there are a number of issues that we want to make sure that are clear and resolved to us before we would make any final, or this committee would make any final decision. So that still holds. So in terms of this recommendation about in-principle support, I suppose it reflects on all that work we've done and the need to make some change, but we do still need to understand these more major issues before any final decision would be made by this committee and government. That's what I hope.
Thank you, David. I'll go now. I'll take your calls for questions, members. I've got, I think, 11 or 12 wanting to pose questions. And I will start with Councillor Bartley, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Thank you for the report. I just wanted to ask, please, the purpose of your report is to provide an update and then seek approval to delegate to us to provide direction for drafting the submission. How come then the recommendation jumps to asking us for our support in principle for implementation of congestion pricing, doesn't even ask us for support in principle of congestion pricing? It goes straight to implementation. So why the jump, noting point 36 where it says, as yet we do not have a formal position? And then by supporting in principle, does that thereby not become formalising a position?
Well, thank you through the chair. I suppose in terms of where officers are coming in terms of the recommendation, and I think this is thinking a bit practically, is one of the challenges in terms of getting congestion pricing in place is really one around really political championing of something, because it is a difficult thing to do. And ultimately, we do need government to change legislation to allow any such pricing scheme to be applied. So in effect, I suppose where we're coming from, given the history of this work, and is that we would be signalling through this in the submission that we are wanting to continue with this work with with the possibility, but not the absolute possibility, of applying congestion charging, and giving a stronger signal to government that this is something that Auckland would want to entertain. If we don't have a sort of statement like that, this is quite a challenging thing for governments to do. So if we're silent on whether or not that we would like at least the option to apply congestion charging, it would be quite more difficult for government, I suppose, to decide that they want to change that legislation. So there is a bit of a thing there in terms of how far does the committee wish to go in terms of signalling it wishes to have the option at least to do to apply a scheme in the future. And in terms of officers and what we've seen in terms of the performance it can make and the need for it in our transport toolkit, we would say it is something that the council would want to have at least as an option. So that is one of the reasons behind it. We've put it in.
Thank you, David. Supplementary?
Supplementary. So is your advice that we also have an option to not provide support in principle in the submission? Noting this committee also made comments that it wanted to hear the views of Aucklanders before it formalised a position on congestion pricing, noting that that kind of process to hear the views of Aucklanders could happen through the select committee process. So why can't we wait until that process happens before we formalise a view?
David.
Well, ultimately, whatever recommendation is made is up to the committee. So if the committee wishes not to have a recommendation saying it supports congestion pricing in principle, given these conditions, it could not do so. the main thing that the committee would need to think about is the signalling that would make to government in terms of this work, sort of thing. So you could remain silent on it and say, you know, we've done this work and this is what we would want from something. So ultimately, it's a bit of a political decision.
Thank you. I'll now go to Member Toe. Member Toe Hanarad, please.
Kia ora. Just a couple of questions. Who prepared the reports that were mentioned in 71 and I think 71 and 72?
So the second report on mana whenua analysis was prepared by a former employee of Auckland Council, Christy Hill. And the first report, I can't quite remember off the top of my head.
The first report.
The social evaluation.
I can speak.
Was it my hand, was it?
The first report was a piece of work done by M.R. Cagney, and it was quite a statistical piece of work that looked at Maori households that were identified as Maori through the census as well as other households.
I'm not sure whether you remember or are aware that IMSB put together some research on when we had the discussion about the fuel tax.
Yeah, absolutely. In effect, just to put some context here, the MRC Cagney work and Kirsty Hill's work was done in response to discussions we had with IMSB on this, which came out of the Sapari work on the RFT, our regional fuel tax. So IMSB at that time asked us to do more detailed work on that so we could get more clarity around these issues for Maori. Yep. Yeah, these are reports that resulted from those discussions.
From those discussions. Thank you. Is there a view that if the congestion charge is yes, then there's a no to the fuel tax?
That is one of the factors that any final decision that would have to consider. So where the congestion question work got to, and as I said on the slides, is that as you collected revenue, and there's a little bit of uncertainty about the level of this revenue because it does depend on the tariffs or the charges that you have in place, the type of the scheme, and its coverage. But it was always thought there would be a hierarchy of, I suppose, using the revenue. The first thing would be that you would use it to operate the scheme because you'd want it to sort of wash its own face, sort of thing. The second thing would be, because it's become so crucial to have these good quality public transport alternatives, you would use money to ensure that that was in place. The third thing which came through strongly in the work was the need to ensure that people under undue hardship there was mitigations in place, so you could use some of the money for that. And once you've done that, it was recommended that it could be used, and this would be a political decision, of course, of a committee like this, to offset the regional fuel tax. You wouldn't be wanting really to charge people twice unless you had to, sort of thing. So that was the hierarchy that was applied. But again, these decisions on a scheme would be something for this committee and council to decide. So the work that we did was to indicate options, I suppose, and what could be done.
And last one, Chair. Has there been any work done on looking at how to mitigate a congestion charge through the use of the community services card?
Yes, there was. I mean, the work has quite a significant paper on mitigations policy. So one of the recommendations of that work was that there would be a community service card would be a first good step to be a part of mitigations policy, but it actually looked at a wider range of a group of people as well. It considered people on gold card and whether that would be a good idea. It also touched on a sort of an area which is more difficult, to be honest, to identify and would need more work, which is around people that are not on a community service card but are of low income and cannot, for whatever reason, change their behaviour through the peak. So this could be a case of say a solo, a single parent on a low income who has childcare obligations and needs to travel. So it identified that group, but so that was where we need to do more further work. And I suppose in my mind, and this is slightly going, it wasn't canvassed by the, the actual report, was this is where some sort of discretionary scheme where people could put themselves forward, like rates remissions, actually, and you could be assessed for support, sort of thing. I think that what's really important from all the work in the TCQ is this is really about changing people's behaviour. It's not about putting an extra tax on a person, and it's definitely not about trying to, detrimentally affect someone who cannot change their behaviour. It's not an extra tax for them. So it's a key principle of the whole work. So, but before any final decision was made, these are the sort of things that really need to be bottomed out, I suppose, and everyone's confident that there's this net to ensure that these cases can be dealt with. But there's been quite a bit of work so far, but there's quite a bit more to do.
Thank you, Member Tauhenere. Councillor Newman, please.
David, thank you very much for your comments this morning. I have a lot of respect for your analysis and your willingness to try and go into the detail of this because it is very complex. You made the comment that so far investment hasn't cracked the congestion nut, that we've still got a long way to go in addressing that challenge. My first question to you is, do you think that the way that we might not have cracked the congestion nut in part because the funding that has flowed has not actually been flowing to address the public transport equity deficit? What we tend to do is to send the funding to augment the public transport services for people who are already quite resilient and who have the most choice. But we don't tend to send the investment to fund public transport alternatives to those people who have the least choice or no choice. And that is a fundamental issue to date, that when we do have funding, the trade-offs become one of allocating the funding to try and get the most increase in public transport patronage as opposed to providing the most choice, which is always very difficult because you're providing choice to people who don't currently have it. The uptake is very slow.
Oh, thank you, Councillor. I mean, there's quite a bit in that question, to be honest, but this is sort of my views on things. The first thing more fundamentally, and this is the big challenge of congestion, is that for a corridor or road that is in high use at certain periods of time, whatever amount of capacity you put on, in some ways you will induce some demand. And it goes back to the fundamental challenge we've got in terms of mode shift, really, that the car is a very convenient way to get around mostly, because it sits on the end of your drive, you jump in there and it goes exactly where you want, and it's very convenient and available at any time. So when the car, I suppose, trip starts to struggle, is that when you get into a peak period of time, there's lots of others on the road, there's not enough space for you, and things slow down for you a lot, and it gets a bit frustrating. Now, in terms of putting on new capacity, if you put more roading capacity on, often you induce more car trips. So over time, you start to get back to that problem, it gets full again. I mean, you've seen things with the Waterview Tunnel, we had some quite big changes for a while, but then you sort of started to see congestion at times starting to appear. The same thing is a challenge also for public transport, because in effect, when you bring public transport capacity on, in some ways, it does free up, I suppose, that roading space for other drivers who now can get back in their cars. So you sort of are caught in a bit of a fundamental trap, really, in my mind. So where I suppose the price or charge comes into it is that before you decide to make that trip, you are faced with a different decision than you would have before, because it doesn't feel free now to get in the car. So when you're going at that time and say you're facing, okay, now it's $2.50, people start to think about, yes, or well, do I really need to go at this time? And what you're really trying to do is getting them to shift to another time, or if they have to go at that time, they shift to a more efficient vehicle. So there is this loop that you struggle with in terms of capacity in general. Now, on your other question, which is really about, I suppose, PT ridership versus patronage, this is quite a bigger question, and it comes back to the essence of how public transport can work. The more broad the coverage, often the more expensive you have in terms of what you need to do it, sort of thing. So there tends to be incentives to bring in more PT where you've got higher density and also more frequent service already. So in effect, I think what you're asking about is a more fundamental PT sort of question, really. But I suppose what I'm saying in terms of demand management is that I suppose it's a bit more fundamental, is the supply of new capacity, even PT capacity, without changing behaviours, will still get you caught in loops on, especially on routes that are in high demand for whatever reason. So I suppose what ATAP was saying is that you need to get people thinking more before they jump in their car. Do they really need to go at that time, or could they shift? Or if they can't shift, ideally there would be another more space-efficient vehicle, a bus or train, to get on to go through that route, sort of thing. So that's the essence of it. So I hope that answers, because I think that your second part of the question is on a slightly different thing from what we're doing in this bit of work, really.
Well, thank you. Well, my follow-up question then, because I don't disagree with what you've said, and it really is a question for Auckland Transport, who will no doubt say to me, well, my concern is addressed at A Roman numeral 2. I'm a South Auckland councillor. I'm currently working with Auckland Transport to get funding confirmed for an August rideshare trial in an area of my ward that doesn't have public transport services. What I have really struggled with Auckland Transport is to address the funding equity deficits. For example, I can't get Auckland Transport to lock itself into getting the Connected Communities Great South Road Corridor project through from Takanini to Papatoi, for example, because we say, oh, well, look, we just can't fund it at this point, so we have to trade off. I can't get the shared path underway to get grade separation to take cyclists in a corridor where they're safe. I can't get that project underway for a bus T2 or T3 lane because I'm told that, well, the funding's just not there. I'm struggling to understand. I agree with what Councillor Bartley has said. I'm struggling to understand why I should support the implementation of a congestion pricing scheme where every single time reasonable alternates are put up for my South Auckland constituents who have the least choice are proposed, I get knocked back because, oh, well, actually, we can't fund it at this point. So I'm wanting more assurance that if we're going to do this, that the specific, not just a generic statement, but specific priorities for introducing PT choice for those who don't have it are going to flow from this or are going to be introduced prior to. Because without that, I'm struggling to see any upside for my constituents. My constituents are paying the fuel tax, and my constituents are the most vulnerable people who would pay the congestion charge, and yet they always seem to be the ones who struggle to win the debate when it comes to the new investment around PT.
Well, thank you, Councillor.
Do you want to pose that as a question? Because I'm interpreting it as debate, and I just ask for questions.
Well, it is a question for Auckland Transport and for our officers, because it goes to the fundamental approaches to the equity of the proposal.
Yeah, I think I can respond to that, Chair. Thank you. Look, in terms of where the congestion question work got to, and I think this is, you've touched on some really fundamental points here, is that you wouldn't want to have congestion charging in place without quality alternatives to getting in the car. So what the congestion question work tried to do was identify sequencing of a regional scheme as a hypothetical regional scheme. So that focused on bringing congestion charging into areas where there was strong PT alternatives now or going to be first, and then it would sequence out. Now, we've always taken from what we've heard from this committee that, in any final scheme, things like that would be crucial because we don't want to have our constituents, especially vulnerable constituents, in a situation where they don't have these alternatives in place. Now, this came through quite clearly, some of these challenges in the social assessment work. The TCQ, I suppose, initiated a very interesting study of 50 mostly low-income people right around Auckland, and they asked them how they would be affected by these charges. And the stories are very interesting and something we would really need to learn from in the scheme. And one thing that came out very strongly from the study is that for a lot of people, they didn't feel that those alternatives were appropriate at the moment. And there was quite a number of statements, I'd be in the bus for hours and things like. So there was clear recognition in the work. And this would come through in our submission that this is something that would need to be done in terms of if you did one of these schemes, as part of the scheme that rolled out, that they would be in place. So I can't really, respond to the other part of the question about the AT thing, but I think you can be assured that what you're describing is something that is quite close to the work that's been done to date. And I think in our submission, our intent would be making it clear that these things need to be clearly identified and resolved before we would place a charge on people.
Thanks, David, for that reply. And Councillor Newman, some of the matters that you raised there will be subject to our decision-making on the Regional Land Transport Plan, and we'll be having a workshop on that in the second week of this month, I think, second or third week of this month. Councillor Walker, please.
I've got a few questions. What I'd appreciate is if you just note the questions down. And those questions go to what work has been done around the impact on the significant number of low-income people that work in the CBD, many of whom come from the south and have woefully inadequate public transport. And if they do have public transport, as that study pointed out, it takes so long that they can't afford to take it because for them, time is money and they may have multiple jobs. So that's one question. The other question I've got, given that you point out that you don't want to set the charge too high, is there going to be adequate revenue generation to fund the massive enhancement in public transport that will be necessary in order to provide choice? The other question I've got is just how does this proposal fit with other proposals that are arguably providing a better incentive, and I'm talking about, let's say, T2 and T3 laning, which do address the fact that they generate a faster trip, which is one of the most fundamental things that people are interested in. And then the other question I've got is just what work has been done, particularly, right now with the impact of COVID, on what the impact of congestion charging will be on businesses in the CBD. And when I say businesses, I'm not just talking about retail activity. I'm talking about people that are working in the CBD and lower numbers there, and arguably the sort of death spiral that we're in now in the CBD for any number of businesses and activities.
Now, do you want to have a reply? You said maybe the staff could take a note of those and come back, because I'm very open to having a written response to a range of questions as well, but would you like that reply written, or do you want it now, councillor?
An officer wants to give some form of rapid reply, then that's fine.
Yeah, I can give some feedback on that. Well, I suppose there's been three pieces of work done on social impacts. In terms of what you're saying about, I suppose a breakdown of some of likely impacts on different income level households. The MR Cagney work is the most extensive piece of work we've done. That goes across on local board type area level, including which picks up the central city. And what that did, and it's quite a complex study, where it tried to look at the current trips, then it applied a hypothetical congestion charging scheme. And now this scheme, actually, the tariff was higher than what ultimately the congestion charging work recommended. But one of the reasons it was high, it was the same scheme that was applied for modelling for the 216 ATAP work. Then it also looked at elasticities, which is a fancy word for how likely would someone be able to shift to another mode or change their behaviours. And then it looked at the income levels. So there was some work done on that. And the long and short of it is the impacts of it on the whole, and this I suppose came from that presentation that Robert gave, is that, and it did break out dollar numbers sort of for average households in these income sort of brackets, is that on the whole, higher income paid absolutely more because they travelled more, and also low income people proportionally paid more of their income. So, and how those, I suppose, burdens fell depended on the local board area, because in effect it would be how likely, I suppose, these households in a local board area would be captured by this hypothetical. It was a regional scheme. So it is dependent, but that works on the Ministry of Transport website. To put colour to that, I suppose, and to take it away from very data-driven work, and this, as I mentioned before, there was a focus study done by the Navigators group of 50 people right around Auckland, but broken down by north, south, central and west, about their likely experiences that would occur to them if the tariff structure as proposed by the Congestion Question report would affect them. And that's also on the site. And this is far more about the people sort of thing. So that was that. In terms of revenue generation, there was a high-level modelling done on likely revenue based on different tariff structures. That would all depend really on the type of option, but to give some flavour of that, the corridor, the regional schemes would generate, based on that tariff structure, more than 200 million a year. So that was some high level. So they do generate revenue, sort of thing. So, and then there was work done that they looked on likely setup costs. So that's in the reports. So in time, it was seen that these schemes would sort of, generate revenue to cover these things, and then you have some money go back. It could go back into things like the regional fuel tax. So they are in the reports. There was work done on wider demand management tools like T2 and T3, but that work was it was not seen to have the performance enhancements of things like of a congestion pricing scheme. So in the thorough reports that have been done, there is work been done on a whole range of wider schemes. Last thing, the COVID-19, I suppose, yes, there has been, I suppose, concerns of would congestion pricing affect, the central city businesses. In some ways, it's interesting in terms of that is also the area that has the most PT services provided, sort of thing. So in my mind, I would see that, and this is what the TCQ reckon, that would be an area that you'd be first trying to move towards, because of its high amount of public transport alternatives that are provided. So in my mind, I always thought that if you had a charge, people would still have access to the central city because of the high ability of public transport to provide that access. That is our area that we have the most access to. So in my mind, I always thought that that would be mitigated by PT.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive reply and grateful for it. So if there are questions, members, that you are happy to put on the table and have a written reply, please let us know. If you'd like the response now, of course, our staff would be very willing. Now, I've got calls from, I think, 11 members for questions. Next is Councillor Casey.
Well, just to signal that I won't be supporting the resolutions as they currently stand, and I'd like to talk about carts and horses, since we're talking about buses and cars. I think in principle support for congestion charging. I've got a question.
If we can go to the question, because otherwise it gets recorded as...
In principle support for congestion charging is putting the cart before the horse. I've been in all these meetings that have been before us, and I've never heard anybody raving about congestion charging. What I have heard is concerns from right around the room. And so my question to you is, I'm looking at paragraph 35, and I'll read it out to you. It's the issues that have been outlined by us to you over a number of years. And then I'll look at paragraph 36, which says, Auckland Council does not yet have formal positions on any of these matters. The inquiry's timeframes do not enable the Council to develop informed positions in time for the submission deadline, particularly that given that further work is required in each case. That being the case, that's full stop. How can we then jump from that position, which is the position as I know it, to in principle support for congestion charging? It's too big a jump, and the Deputy Chair got it absolutely right. So I'm looking forward to the Chair amending the submission, or there'll be a vote against the whole thing. What you want to do is bring us along, especially me, because I'm kicking and screaming, so I'm a good one to bring along. But you ain't going to do it by forcing it. And the other aspect of this, there is a political debate that the officers cannot engage in, which we will be engaging in. And that shouldn't be today. That should be at the end of all of this, when all those questions that we don't have a formal position on have been answered. So what was my question? It was about...
It is a sort of a...
There was a question. There was a question.
You've got to be careful we don't go beyond question and into debate, members.
No,
so
my
the question is
this.
how did
we
that...
do not have a formal position in support of congestion charging. You may have, directions have been given to further investigate. Is that correct? We do not have a formal position supporting, in principle, congestion charging.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, as I mentioned before, there is no formal resolution yet.
My second question relates to ongoing dialogue with the public, which I see up there. Ongoing. Can you tell me what the dialogue with the public to date has been from Auckland Council? Sorry, it's for Brian in the middle.
Thank you, Councillor. The dialogue with public has been very limited to date, and there's been a number of reasons for that. Primarily, the most primary reason is that we're working in partnership with government, and there was a view that we would do significant technical work, which was the phase 2 work, to put us in a situation that we'd feel confident, I suppose, in terms of what we could take to the public. And the phase 3 work, when you had a resolution that was from this committee, said that, we needed, as a partner group, to start to have that conversation with the people of Auckland. As I mentioned before, as Robert mentioned in his presentation, phase 3 work has been put on hold as we're trying to understand how the select committee process now fits into the picture.
Thank you, Dave.
So it's just to point out that resolution then that you have, there has been no ongoing dialogue. So
thank you, Councillor. There's been dialogue with a number of stakeholders, however, which we have indicated before at these meetings. But in terms of, I suppose, a public discourse more widely, there hasn't. Yeah.
Thanks. I was just going to say, as far as I'm concerned, this is a massive change to the way that every person in Auckland goes about their business.
You're in debate, though,
And
okay? So I'll just take it as a speaking turn.
No, it just demands dialogue. I mean, we haven't... So I'm just pointing out the error in your resolution. There has been no ongoing dialogue. We are demanding dialogue with the people of Auckland, and I would like to reserve my right to speak.
Okay, so that was a question of me because I've added that particular line. Okay, so if you read the B, note that the submission to the Transport and Infrastructure Committee will make key points in relation to, and then you go down to the 6th, the need for ongoing dialogue with Aucklanders. So the Select Committee is opening up a dialogue process, and that motion says we ask for that to be ongoing and not to conclude at the end of the Select Committee process. Okay? So it is ongoing from the Select Committee dialogue process and that it continues. I hope that clarifies it. Thank you. Councillor Coon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I have my question's in 3 parts. The first one is around, obviously, that equity concerns are a massive issue, but the starting point should be in terms of recognising that our current transport system is deeply inequitable for many reasons, and I just wondered if you're able to talk to that, because I don't find that in the report in terms of the current inequalities of the transport system, whether it goes to pollution, transport poverty, health outcomes, bigger impacts on climate change. So can you talk to that at all? Do you have that expertise?
Well, that's something that I probably would need to come back on, but equity is a very big issue in how you define it. So yeah, that's something probably the team would come back to you on rather than try to talk to that now.
Well, that goes to my second question, is that we're talking about mitigating the impacts on equity in our submission, whereas I would have thought that we're trying to move towards an equitable transport system, and congestion pricing or road user pricing is a key part of that if the investment goes back to vulnerable communities, if it addresses those inequalities. So I guess it's a question I'm hoping very much that we are going to delegate this submission. So, Mr. Chair, I'd hope that rather than, the resolution is around mitigating inequalities, but we should be framing it around how we are actually going to use this to get to an equitable transportation system, which I would have thought is our goal and picks up a lot of those concerns.
Well, let me maybe respond in terms of how congestion, which I suppose is the topic of the submission, does impact on equity. And I suppose what the essence of most transportation systems are trying to provide is access to many opportunities, ideally within a reasonable time. And there's a number of metrics that are often used, primarily the big one being that you can access employment within 30 minutes by car or 45 minutes by public transport. And that is the metrics that we've used consistently through ATAP. So in terms of congestion, that reduces those metrics for both, really. So if you look at, I suppose, the nature of the way the city is structured and its city shape, is that there are more, I suppose, areas of low income that are probably making longer journeys than that, and also, I suppose, in terms of the nature of the city's shape. So by trying to reduce congestion, you are opening more access to people of low income. Obviously, if people can't get that access because there are no alternatives for them, or they cannot, the charge is detrimental to the ability to assess those opportunities, that's not what the scheme is trying to do. But ultimately, I suppose why congestion questions can improve equity is you are opening in the amount of opportunities that are available to you by either car or public transport within a more appropriate time. So that's one of the key things that congestion charging can bring in terms of equity.
So just on that point, look, there's staff that are scribing and they're taking notes from this conversation that we're having, and I think yours is a very important one. And I think it's consistent with Councillor Newman's and a lot of others, I think.
And I'd
around
hope
the
the
state.
draft submission, if we get to that point, can
You
be
will
circulated
see
to everyone. That would be great. And just a third question, which I think is important to raise, I don't want to raise it for written because we're going to be debating this, is I went to the climate impact statement and I thought this is going to be a fantastic opportunity to say that we have a climate plan te taurukia tawhiri. Addressing transport emissions is going to be our biggest focus if we're going to achieve 50% reductions of emissions by 2030. I thought I was going to read that we passed resolutions in respect of ATAP and the RLTP, saying that an emissions reduction pathway is really important part of that work in terms of approving those documents. And so I got to the emissions statement and it doesn't even mention that we have a climate plan. It doesn't even mention how this bit of work is going to help us achieve our emissions reductions. It doesn't put it in the context of our previous decisions. So I guess this is really a question to Megan, to be fair, is how on earth did that climate impact statement get into the report when it's basically saying that us breathing in this room does not have an impact on emissions at this very moment. And, you know, it's just so disappointing to see that there, because this was a really fantastic opportunity to highlight all of the work that we are doing in this space.
Through the chair, so I apologise. Yep, so you're obviously disappointed with that, and I hear that. Firstly, and this is not a justification, obviously we can do much of that in the submission, and I think that's what you would want us to do. Look, in reading that, I think it is a reasonably literal and factual couple of paragraphs. We could have done better. I think also, though, we need to understand that the work done so far is some of the evidential or analysis base. We are not yet clear, or I don't believe we are, on what the real emissions impact could be from congestion charging, plus in conjunction with everything else that we in Auckland and New Zealand could do. So I'm satisfied that we probably couldn't go to a level of really understanding what it might mean, but I take your point on, and I do take that feedback.
Yeah, I just, if I could just add, I mean, the Māori impact statement starts with our policy and our framework, and then it goes through how this is going to work towards that. I would have thought just take the same approach, and I know that's been hard work. I don't know if the IMSB members would agree in terms of that. We're getting to a point where we're recognising the context and then we talk to the context. And that's what exactly we have got to do with the climate impact statement. We've got to start with the fact we have a plan and then work from there in terms of what this decision making, where does it take us? So I just don't want to keep being a scratch record on this one, but this is such an important piece of work around that. Thank you.
Thank you. Got that. Now, members, I think we need to take a stretch break, maybe 10 minutes. If we could adjourn now until quarter past midday, please.